Thanks for joining us today. My name is Theo Gonzalves, and I'm the interim director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. And today I'm really happy to be able to talk with author Peter Bacho, who has a new book out called Uncle Rico's Encore. So Peter, we'll get started with a few questions, and we'll go back and forth on a few things that I've highlighted in the text. And if you want to be able to read from any of the passages, you're happy to do so. But why don't we just get started with some questions that I have?
Okay, sounds good. Let me know when your audience wants to hear at least a partial reading, and I can cut to that.
Okay, sounds good. Let's talk about your parents, because this is really a memoir of your time growing up in Seattle. And I think a lot of folks who are aware of your work know that you're from the Seattle area. Your dad arrives in 1929, which couldn't have been a worse time for Filipinos to come to the United States, right in the middle of the Great Depression. And then your mother arrives 20 years later in 1949. How different a world it was for Filipinos from 1929 to 1949. But I want to talk about the Seattle that you grew up in. So much of it, that early part of the book, you mentioned it's organized around maps and the different neighborhoods that you grew up around. Why was it important for you to arrange the book in that first part around the different neighborhoods in Seattle?
Because these neighborhoods to me are very, very precious. I think in map 2, I write about Immaculate Conception Church, which is in school, which was basically the heart of old Filipino Seattle. Many of my friends, some of whom, in terms of friendships, we're talking about half a century now. We were very, very close. And I just wanted to commemorate these neighborhoods and the people, the Filipino people and other folks as well who lived within them.
Yeah. And certainly one of the neighborhoods was Yesler. It figures into the title of one of your other books. Could you describe what that neighborhood was like to grow up in?
I didn't grow up in Yesler, but I spent a lot of time there because my first real crush lived there, and I used to spend time playing basketball there, so I knew it pretty well. A lot of Filipinos grew up in the projects, in Yesler Terrace and in Rainier Vista in the South End. We were far from being a wealthy community, blue collar, for the most part, and the benefits that the second generation had were basically foreclosed to the members of that first generation. So I mean, things opened up when I started growing up, and I think that's true for most of my peers.
Yeah. Let's talk about the working class nature of the Filipino communities that were there, and not just Filipino communities, but also other Asian American and African American communities in the area. You talk about the most successful example of Filipino resistance. This was what really struck me in the book. The most successful example of Filipino resistance was Local 37 and the ILWU. Could you talk about that labor history and why it's so important for you to remember?
Well, I mean, it's because for many Asian Americans, the notion was that they were passive, but I not in terms of the community that I was raised. These men and women were far from passive, and younger Filipinos right now are flocking to Delano, California, and getting the story right about Larry Itliong and how he was the one that initially led the table grape strike in 1965. Well, that's an example of resistance, and Carlos Bolusan details other examples of resistance to conditions that were racist and unfair. But people know that younger people who are curious know about what happened in California. Very few of them know about what happened in Seattle. And it's centered around ILWU Local 37 which during the McCarthy era was led by a communist, a good friend of mine, a fellow by the name of 𝚗𝚗𝚌𝚕𝚎 𝚂𝚗, who is incidentally Jose in Carlos Bulosan's America's in the Heart. He was a remarkable man, and the rank and file was very, very loyal to him. And if you can imagine the enormous power of the federal government trying to crush a Filipino union in the 1950s during the McCarthy era, led by a communist. I mean, he didn't make any bones about the fact where his political affiliation led. I'm sure, as I noted in the story, that what immigration and naturalization, what they wanted was for the rank and file to vote Gonzalves and his compadres out of power, but that never happened. They continued to vote and re-elect him as president of the union. You know, he brought his old friend Carlos Bulosan, I think, to edit. It's either 52 or 54, the yearbook up there. And it's like much of what we see in America's in the Heart, in which Carlos writes an essay about the workers' struggle and how the forces, capitalism and the forces of oppression will eventually fail, et cetera, et cetera. This is pretty daring stuff during the McCarthy era, when Americans, quite frankly, were terrorized by kind of this hideous cleansing movement that McCarthy unleashed. I mean, people were turning on each other. That didn't happen amongst the Pinoys in Seattle. I'm very proud of that.
And it's a point worth emphasizing. It's not just about the story of 𝚗𝚗𝚌𝚕𝚎, but it's also about the rank and file who year after year continued to vote him back into that.
Yeah, every 2 years,
power.
if I'm not mistaken, every 2 years. And it's because these old Pinoys, many of them had seen worse sorts of situations. They're migrant workers. More than a few of them were combat veterans, including my Uncle Rico. And they'd seen worse in their lifetime here, a country that did not want them. And their attitude was basically, fuck you. We choose our leaders. The federal government does not choose our leaders. And so they continue to retain 𝚗𝚗𝚌𝚎𝚎 as the president of the union, a communist leader in the middle of the McCarthy era. And that's amazing if you think about it. It's one of these kind of hidden histories of the old community that I take a certain amount of pride in. And that attitude was passed on to my generation. We didn't face the kinds of obstacles that they faced, but still, the racism was there, the low expectations, they were all there. Less blatant, but it was all there.
Right. And so when you have a double standard that is in the air and in the soil of American culture, of racism that holds people to very different standards across the board, sometimes it falls to other types of culture in terms of sports and leisure that allows people to kind of think about how those double standards can be either washed away or played away. So you write quite a lot about sports, and it's fascinating to hear you talk about your own turn with baseball and basketball, as well as boxing. Could you talk about the role of sports in your own time growing up as a kid and what that meant to participate in all of these sports?
It was a way to prove yourself. I used to, basketball, I played against the best players in the city. And my dream was to play college basketball, but that was basically evaporated after the end of my senior season in high school. Boxing, again, it's another way to prove yourself. I got to a certain level, and the fact that my dad's generation, they were all huge boxing fans, and so I wanted to do what my my parents and my uncles loved watching others do, which was to box, and I actually became okay at it. We reached a level. I decided I was too old to continue this nonsense and moved on to other things.
And is that when you took up martial arts, or was that before? Because you
No,
also ended up.
I took up. I was with the Bruce Lee school from '67 to about '90. Bruce's first Kwoon, her studio was in Seattle. I never met him. I joined in '67, and I think a year or two before, he had headed off to LA to make his mark. But it was in Chinatown. And at the time, it was downstairs and across the street from a landmark restaurant, the old Four Seas, right in the middle of Chinatown. And it was a rough, tough place. But you know, I read everything about Bruce as a young kid. And one of the things he kept stressing is that to effectively fight, you have to make contact. You know, you have to see if your punches and kicks work. And the sport that came closest to his advice was boxing, because you could rock a guy, you could drop him, he could drop you. Does this work? Does this not work? I mean, he was all about what works, and the only way you could find out what works is to put all your juice into a punch and see if it works.
That's right. Very, very pragmatic.
Very pragmatic. Very pragmatic. I admired Bruce because not only was he a physical marvel, but in terms of having, I mean, he was standing up against thousands of years of Chinese tradition in terms of Chinese beliefs about the martial arts, you know, Qi and all this and that. And he stood it on its head. Look, if you can't land this punch and knock this other guy down, I'm sorry. You can summon as much energy as you want to, but it ain't going to do one lick of good.
Yeah.
So, I mean, boxing was practical. And I incorporated that into, we incorporated that into our martial arts routine.
Yeah, certainly. And you wrote a lot about this in another book called Boxing in Black and White, which
yes, I did.
I hope a lot of folks that are viewing this will be able to check out later as well. So Peter, this has been great. I want to also get a chance to talk, circle back to the history of your mother. Now, quite a lot of your stories and a lot of your work has focused on the stories of men, especially the workers coming out of ILWU, a lot of veterans. But your stories about your mother are really important in this book. And I want you to talk about her as a political activist in Seattle, because this is also helps to reclaim some of the stories about Asian American and Filipino American women taking very central roles in all of our communities.
Yeah, they did. Mom was very keen to the reality of bias, and she was not one to or unfairness, and she was not one to kind of you know, roll over when she confronted it. And certainly that was true in one of the stories where two maids for the Philippine consulate here in Seattle escaped because they were being mistreated, and most of the community, whether it's because they had still ties in the Philippines and didn't want to upset the Marcos regime, whatever, kind of turned their back on them. But Mom didn't. Father Ocaña, who was the parish priest at Immaculate, asked Mom to take them in, which she did. She took them in, provided them shelter, and it was for me, it was a very proud moment, and of one person doing the right thing or trying to do the right thing, and I was very proud of her. She was like that, though. That's just the way she was. I mean, she was a survivor of the Japanese occupation. She knew hardship, and she also knew discrimination and poverty. And she was center the central point, the moral point for our family.
Mm-hmm. And does this do the characteristics of your mother make their way into your first book, 𝚑𝚘𝚜?
Yeah, they do. I named the character who dies there Remedios, which is my mom's name. Why travel far from the source, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I could write about I can write about Filipinos, and I don't have to write about anyone else because they have all the drama that one could ever possibly, and all conflict that any reader could possibly hope for. So I mean, it's like I don't really need to leave this territory. All the drama is there. All the comedy is there.
Yeah. And the example that was set by your mother as well as your dad, being local activists and folks that were engaged in the civic life of the community, that must have had an impact on you coming up, wanting to become eventually an attorney and then a reporter. Is that how it worked out for you? And
Yeah,
in terms of career choice?
yeah. I became an attorney. I hadn't quite thought it through yet, but I was doing very well in college. One of the few of my generation that actually went to college. To my surprise, I was doing really pretty well there. And so someone said, why don't you go to law school? And I hadn't thought about that. That's not a job that Filipino kids of my era thought about. Mm-hmm. And the more I thought about it, the more enticing it became. So I applied, got accepted, passed the bar, and from that point on, I basically blew my career because I thought about the symbolic import of being a Filipino attorney and passing the bar, becoming legitimate, I guess. But I hadn't thought about what it would take to actually practice. And so if I were a younger man and doing it all over, I probably would have changed my dream. And said, oh, this is what it means to become a successful attorney. Oh, wow. The office, the corner office on the 42nd floor, the big building down. I never thought like that. My dreams are only passing the bar. So once I did that, that was the height of my career.
Right.
Your brother's an attorney, right?
Yeah, he is. He's working as a political organizer in Southern California. So he's put his legal training to other use. And
he's a smart man.
Like a lot of things, and it's probably true in your life. I mean, law school ends up becoming a way of thinking, a certain kind of training.
It does. I used it when I was doing foreign policy pieces. I was writing at the time for the Christian Science Monitor. I was writing for the top foreign policy journals. Marcos is bad. The United States needs to change its position, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, and this is before the internet, these opinion pieces started to have an impact, and the United States did change its policy. So Marcos died. He's thrown out of power. He dies, and I lost a career.
Well, that's the
got to move on to something else.
Yeah. Well, that's the fate of studying something like the Philippines. I mean, things can turn on a dime, and and you were certainly in the thick of it right at the end of the Marcos regime.
I was in the thick of it. Yep. That was decades and decades ago. It must have been at least 2 or 3 lifetimes ago.
Right. But then there becomes a transition from lawyer to a journalist, and then eventually to a writer as well. And these aren't always seamless, or they don't always necessarily make sense at the time. But it certainly probably makes things easier when you have people to hang your hat onto, to take cues from, people like Ben Santos. Can you talk about what it's like to learn from someone like Bienvenido Santos? You talk about that in the book.
Oh yeah, I studied Ben, and he's a master of the short form. And he was a master of subtlety. His writing was beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Capturing that immigrant experience is something that can be a little tricky, especially with nuance. And what does that mean for you to take him on as an influence and to write about him in this book?
To to use subtlety, to not over-explain, right? To let the actions and the words of the characters carry the story. To not over-explain it, I mean, through excessive narration, that sort of thing. I love The Scent of Apples. It's one of my favorite works because of its subtlety and its nuance. And it also helped me figure out how to arrange my first collection, Dark Blue Suit. Yeah. So, I mean, he was a font of knowledge and inspiration for me. And it's a beautiful collection. I'm sorry I never had a chance to personally meet 𝚑𝚕𝚎 𝚃𝚛𝚎, but I admired his work enormously.
Yeah. So Scent of Apples is obviously his collection of stories that you certainly recommend that to folks that are watching this. Is there a story within Scent of Apples that you think people should pay attention to?
Yeah, there are all kinds of stories in there, but one of my personal favorites is the short story Scent of Apples. There's, you know, that's the title of the collection, but it's also the title of the short story. I was just really taken by that story.
Yeah, definitely.
Beautiful story. Or there's one where I cite the death of this young mestizo boy. I thought that was, and I can't remember, I don't have the book in front of me, so I can't remember that story, but they flow so seamlessly together, particularly once he gets off the West Coast. It follows his journal. Ben is the narrator, and follows his journal journey all the way across the United States, and finally back to Manila itself. And there's this really stark story for these ruins in which the Filipinos stuck in the United States during the war are approaching Manila. The boat is approaching Manila, and what they see is devastation and heartbreak. And I thought that was a very nice rendering of the emotions that people felt upon returning to the Philippines after the end of the war.
So for folks who are interested in maybe trying their own craft at becoming a short story writer or a novelist, how would you encourage people to get started with their own work?
Do a little bit of reading, first of all. You got to get a nice, manageable, overall bulk nonfiction writing. I usually use Gardner's work, John Gardner, The Art of Fiction. It's manageable and it's short. And then what you're going to end up doing, this is what I recommend, is that you start to imitate writers that you admire until you develop your own style.
Right.
And eventually you will develop your own style. Don't feel bad about borrowing techniques or stealing techniques, because writers before you have done it.
That's right.
Continue to do it.
Yeah, and it's true for martial artists and musicians and just about everyone who's trying to think about their own craft. Is you kind of you emulate the people that influence you, and then
you steal their work.
That's right.
Until you find your own voice, and if you're at it long enough, eventually you will find your own voice.
Yeah. So speaking of your own voice, Peter, how about we turn to your own text? I'd love for the viewers to be able to hear from a passage in this collection.